All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into Melania Trump's memoir, Melania. And, everyone knows her public image. I mean, the fashion, the stoicism, that whole be best era. But this memoir, I mean, this is her attempt to take control and tell her own story, right? What did you think of her portrayal? I mean, did it line up with the Melania you thought you knew?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the book, it really tries to paint this picture of someone who wants privacy,
Yeah.
in the middle of a very public life, which I guess is kind of ironic considering her position, would you say?
Yeah, totally. And she talks about growing up in Slovenia, her modeling career, then all of a sudden, bam, she's married to Donald Trump, thrust onto the world stage, right? It's presented as this, constant reinvention. But did you buy it? Did it feel genuine?
I think there are these little moments where you see like a more down-to-earth Melania, especially when she's talking about raising Baron. But then she kind of goes back to this very controlled, almost guarded tone.
Yeah, and that controlled narrative. I mean, that's what everyone's talking about with this book, right? I mean, compared to like Michelle Obama's Becoming, which felt so raw and personal, Melania almost reads like a very carefully, curated press release.
It's interesting, right? Like, she even mentions disagreements with some of the Trump administration's policies, like the family separations at the border. But even then, it's very measured, like she's holding back.
Almost like she's tiptoeing around the real story. So it makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what's the strategy here, right? Is this like calculated image control, or is this just Melania being Melania? What are your thoughts?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, remember, she was under constant scrutiny, especially during those White House years. So this memoir, it kind of feels like her way of taking back some control, presenting herself on her own terms.
Okay, but does it work? I mean, did you come away feeling like you knew Melania any better after reading this?
That's the tricky part. I think you get some insights into her life for sure, but it often feels like she's just skimming the surface.
Yeah.
It's almost as if she's more concerned with like preserving a certain image than with actually, being really introspective.
So it's less about vulnerability and more about image management.
Exactly. Like take her description of the White House, for example.
Mm.
She talks about, her initiatives like Be Best and how she was, trying to uphold tradition and protocol. But it all feels very sanitized.
Like she's airbrushing out the more chaotic parts of that whole era. Do you think that ultimately hurts or helps her message?
That's a tough one. On one hand, you can admire her composure, her resilience in such a crazy environment. But then on the other hand, it creates this distance. Like she's not really willing to let us see the real her.
Which brings us to this fascinating point. How
Yeah.
does this Melania compare to the Melania we saw in the public eye, Did the memoir actually change your perception of her at all?
There were definitely moments where that carefully constructed facade seemed to crack a little bit. Like when she's talking about being a mother to Baron, you see these flashes of a more relatable human side. But then she quickly retreats back into that controlled narrative.
So we're left with this question. Is the real Melania somewhere in between these two extremes?
I think that's the mystery she leaves us with. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe she wants us to keep guessing.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Her childhood, her, sudden rise to fame, the White House years, and that ever-present theme of control. But let's zoom in on some specific moments from the book. When we come back, we'll unpack those in more detail.
Welcome back. So before we move on, I'm curious, were there any specific moments from the book that really stood out to you?
Yeah, there were a few. I mean, I was surprised by how she described meeting Donald Trump. It was all
Yeah.
very whirlwind, romance, love at first sight kind of thing. Did that ring true for you?
It's interesting because she does acknowledge, the challenges of being married to someone so high profile and, let's be honest, controversial. But she also seems very aware of how that relationship like impacted her own career, her own identity.
Right. She went from being this successful model to basically, Donald Trump's wife in the eyes of the world. Do you think she ever fully reconciles those two versions of herself in the book?
I'm not so sure. She claims she never lost sight of her own goals.
Yeah.
But it does feel like her individual identity gets kind of overshadowed by her role as wife and then later First Lady.
And speaking of that First Lady role, she talks a lot about tradition and protocol, about, upholding the dignity of the office. But was that genuine, or was it more about controlling her image in that very specific environment?
I think it's a bit of a balancing act.
Yeah.
Take the Be Best campaign, for instance. On one hand, it aligns with that, traditional First Lady initiative focused on children's well-being. But on the other hand, it could be seen as this deliberate attempt to kind of sidestep the political landmines of the Trump administration.
Almost like she's creating this, carefully curated bubble around herself separate from all the chaos that's happening right outside the White House walls.
Exactly. And it's in those moments where she deviates from that carefully crafted image,
Yeah.
things get really interesting. Like when she talks about disagreeing with the family separation policy, it's one of the few times you see her genuine feelings like breakthrough.
Right. And
Yeah.
then there's how she addresses, all those rumors and scandals. It's almost like she's using the book to like directly refute the media's portrayal of her, to rewrite the narrative on her own
This
terms.
constant thread throughout the memoir,
That's
right? This need to control the narrative to shape how the public perceives her. It makes you wonder how much of what we're reading is the real Melania and how much is this carefully constructed image.
It's almost like she's presenting us with this highlight reel, but leaving out all the less flattering or messy parts. Did you get a sense of who she really is beyond the fashion and the stoicism?
There are glimpses for sure, especially when she talks about being a mother to Baron. You see the softer side of fierceness that feels very genuine. But those moments are fleeting.
It's like she's letting us peek behind the curtain, but only for a second before she closes it again. So we're left with this question. Is the real Melania the polished public figure, the private mother, or something in between?
And maybe that's the point she's trying to make, that even after reading this memoir, there's still a mystery to her. She's not giving us all the answers.
All right, so we've talked about her motivations, her image, her relationships, but what about the broader context? How does Melania fit into the landscape of other First Lady memoirs, especially in this age of social media and, hyper scrutiny?
That's a great question, and one we should definitely dive into. When we come back, let's explore what this memoir might tell us about the future of First Lady narratives and the evolving role of women in politics.
Okay, so we've been kind of dissecting Melania's memoir, and this idea of control keeps coming up, right? Do you think she's maybe setting like a new standard for how First Ladies tell their stories?
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. I mean, think about it. We're in this age of social media where every word is like analyzed, every photo scrutinized. It makes sense that people in the public eye,
Hmm.
they might become even more careful about how they present themselves, even in a memoir.
So in a way, Melania is almost like a reflection of our times. Like authenticity is great, and all but maybe self-preservation through image control is like the new name of the game.
It's an interesting thought for sure, and it goes beyond just first ladies too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
look at celebrities, politicians, anyone who's in the public eye, they're all hyper aware of their image these days, crafting these narratives for maximum impact.
But does that make those narratives less genuine, less relatable?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
In Melania's case, it does feel like she's holding back a little, prioritizing image over like true introspection. But maybe that's just her personality. Maybe that's how she deals with the pressures of public life.
It's like she's saying, this is the version of myself I'm comfortable sharing, and we as readers have to decide if that's enough for us, right?
Exactly. And makes you wonder, what will future First Lady memoirs look like?
Yeah.
Will they all follow this, carefully curated approach?
Ugh.
Or will there be a return to more raw, unfiltered storytelling?
I guess only time will tell. But it's definitely something to think about as we kind of consume these narratives, not just from First Ladies, but from anyone in the public eye. How much control is too much? And when does self-preservation cross that line into inauthenticity?
Those are great questions to think about. For me, I think it ultimately comes down to individual choice.
Mm.
Melania chose to tell her story in this very specific way with a high degree of control. And we as readers, we can choose to accept that, question it, or even reject it entirely.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so here we are at the end of our deep dive into Melania. It's been a fascinating journey for sure, full of twists and turns and these very carefully crafted narratives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've explored her childhood, her marriage, her time in the White House, and I think most importantly, her attempts to control her own story. And while we may not have all the answers, I think we've gained some valuable insights into the world, according to Melania Trump.
I think so too. Well, thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us, and we hope you'll join us again next time for our next exploration of another fascinating topic. Until then, keep those minds curious and those questions coming.